Welcome back to the For All the Saints podcast, and I'm delighted to have with me Trevan Hatch here for we're doing kind of an Easter episode, Easter themed, because Trevan wrote the fantastic book Greater Love Hath No Man, which is kind of a Latter-day Saint guide to celebrating Easter, and he wrote that alongside friend of the podcast Eric Huntsman. So Trevan, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, not a problem. I love doing this stuff, and I appreciate the invite.
I appreciate you accepting the invite. It's really great for me. And well, this is about Easter, but we're actually recording this on Shrove Tuesday. Do you celebrate Pancake Day over in America? Is that a thing?
It is in Louisiana where I lived. They do king cake, and there's all kinds of traditions. But so you guys do pancakes over there, right?
Yeah. And crepes and everything. Yeah. It's a very unhealthy day. I had that for lunch. But what is a king cake? A king cake? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it's like this. Yeah, when I lived there, I went to one of the schools I went to was Louisiana State. When I was there, it's a big cake that they eat on Fat Tuesday or Shrove Tuesday, and they'll put little baby Jesuses sometimes, little plastic ones in there, and you eat it, and the person who finds the little baby Jesus might have to, they either get good luck for the rest of the year or they're assigned to make the next year's cake or something. I don't know. There's a lot of tradition.
I had no idea of that. Is it something but it's not in Utah? They don't kind of do pancakes on Shrove Tuesday?
No, no, Utah, I've seen nothing unless I'm aloof. I haven't seen anything. The only people that do anything are my colleagues here at BYU who went to Louisiana State University. And they'll have king cake,
That's so interesting. I want to do king cake now in the UK. I've never heard that before. But anyway, I digress. Your book, it's such a brilliant book with Eric. How did that book come about?
Yeah, I pull it down off the shelf just to give a little screenshot. And this book I'll just show you a little bit. It's just phenomenal. Then I'll tell you how. We have numerous pictures. I don't know if you can see from these cameras, but just a gorgeous book with pictures. And, but how that happened was so for a couple of years from like 2018 to 2020, those years, every time Holy Week would come around, like my antennas would go up because I'm a religious studies scholar. And it's also during Passover, for Jews. And so, I my training's in Jewish studies. And so I'm paying attention to this stuff, and I always have holy envy during that time of year. So I think it's what's the year that President Nelson, I think it's 2021. It was the year after COVID in 2021 when there was nobody in the conference center for conference, right? And we did the Hosanna shout on Palm Sunday. Yeah. I think that was 2021. And I absolutely loved it. And there was this big, theme of Palm Sunday. And so the next morning on Monday, I was driving to work and I called Eric Huntsman. So my colleague, Dr. Eric Huntsman here at BYU, I called him and I said, hey, I want a guide that I can use for my own family. Like I could create one, which is essentially what the book ended up being, but I want something tangible that I could go through, kind of a ritual with my family. And would you be interested in publishing it with me, and we can make it available to other people? And he said, the reason why I asked him is because he's already invested into this topic. Like he had a blog where each day, he'd go through Holy Week and he'd have art and music and different suggestions and different things. So he was the logical choice, and he'd already published a book in 2011. I think it was called For God So Loved the World, if I remember. A similar theme, right? He went through, like it was a kind of a Holy Week book, but he had the rights to it. And I knew that. And so I said, how about we just republish your book, like reprint it, and then let's add some stuff to it. And I just proposed this structure. I said, it can be 4 parts. The first part, let's put the scriptural blocks in the book that Christian tradition says, this happened on this day, whatever. And so not all the text, but some of the important texts. And so people can, in part 1, they can read the text associated with that particular day. And just and then the next day on Monday or Tuesday, they can read those texts and just kind of follow Jesus through the last week of his life. And then in part 2 of the book, we can have scholarship include a bunch of scholarship on those themes that they read about. And that's Eric's book. And then I had done a bunch of research and writing that didn't end up in some of my books. So I can embed that in, and, we could just kind of massage it and do whatever we want. And then the third section was going to be a short section on how Christians throughout the centuries have celebrated and observed this particular day, all the different traditions, to give Latter Saints a little bit of holy envy and some ideas on how to increase their, only family traditions. And then the fourth section would be suggestions for Latter-day Saints, just different things that Eric has done with his family or me with mine. And there's some other people who have written books for Latter-day Saints, for Holy Week, for kids or whatever. So that was the structure that I proposed. And Eric said, yeah, let's do it. And so this book is the product of that. And what's fascinating is, so that was we started right away, like literally that week when I called him, and Eric jumped on it. It took us about a year to write the book, to submit it to Deseret Book and to the Religious Studies Center at BYU. And it was supposed to come out in 2022. So during that whole year, we actually sent a bunch of copies to the brethren. Some of the apostles that we thought would appreciate it. I mean, all of them would appreciate it, but there were some that we absolutely knew would love it. So Eric had a few connections over the years with some of the brethren. So he sent them some manuscripts. And then we decided to put the book on hold we were supposed to come out in 2022. We changed it to 2023 because that was the New Testament year in gospel doctrine. And so we waited. And so throughout that year, we were in constant conversation with different departments. It was over like, do we have to use King James text in the book, or can we use our translations? And there was lots of different people that wanted some input, and to go through all the channels. And so in all of those discussions, we had the Liahona magazine contact us and wanted us to write an article for Liahona. So that also happened. So by the time 2023 came around, a lot of people were sort of excited, and then conference hit in April 2023. And if I remember, there was 4 or 5 of the brethren who specifically mentioned Holy Week and Palm Sunday, Good Friday. Elder Stevenson did it. Let's see, Elder Rasband, and President Nelson did. So it was great. So we're like, yes, we can help. Help sort of this team effort from the brethren and scholarship to try to democratize, Holy Week, because it's sometimes like speeding in the wind to change, the culture for one way or another. So that was really fun to see. And that was in 2023. So this is the third cycle with this book, and we've had a blast with it. It's been fun.
It's interesting. You mentioned the kind of talks and kind of cultural shift there from some of the brethren. And I wondered what you thought of President Oak's recent video on behalf of the first presidency about Easter and Easter traditions. I think it was only a week or so ago that it was released, but he mentioned a specific tradition in there that is used in, I don't know if it's Anglican churches or Catholic churches, where there's kind of an almost a phrase that is said and repeated to one another about he is risen or something, and someone repeats he is risen indeed, or something like that. I wondered what you thought of his whole video, though.
I absolutely love it. And same thing so what Elder Oaks did is he's kind of priming the pump and helping us think about, and this is what we did in the book, and it's what Elder Stevenson did, and that is to try to have holy envy and pull in, or at least be inspired by other traditions that, because I feel like we've missed out. For some reason, we've sort of, been enthused about like St. Valentine's Day, which is not a problem. It's a Catholic sort of thing, but Easter has just been sort of nothing. A few families do things here and there, and then you'll have you'll have a Easter egg hunt with the family and go eat at grandma's or whatever. But it was intriguing to learn and to try to figure out, and we put some of this in the book, of why Latter-day Saints have not celebrated historically. And we could talk about maybe some of the reasons why. But so when the brethren are doing these little videos and talking about it and showing support, and they want us to do a Leah Hone article. That's really fun because it shows that we can start to think about these things in relation to our Christian brothers and sisters. Like we don't have to, like we did in a prior century, constantly develop our traditions in relation to them. It's like encounter to them. We can do it with them. So that's what's really fun that's happening. To see Elder Oaks do that and some of the others. So it's really fun. That the idea, I guess, that we have is that do you guys have in the UK? Do you guys have trunk or treat? Is that spilled over?
That's a recent kind of American import in the last few years.
Yeah. So I mean, we've probably been doing this maybe a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades. But so when I was a kid, we didn't do it, and then in my adulthood, we started doing it. And I watched that somewhere some ward did it, and then 2 wards did it. And after a few years, everyone's doing it, and it's logical and it makes sense. It's fun. That's the kind of idea that we had with this. Like if we could just get enough traction and we could get enough bishops and planning committees, like activities, committees in the wards to put in the calendar, and allocate a budget for Easter, an Easter party or Easter celebration or whatever, like we do with Christmas and like we do with Halloween or whatever. Then we could see this grow. And in 2 decades, we could have, it's just a given that the new bishop comes in or the new activities chair. And that's just a given that you have an Easter celebration, not just in sacrament where you kind of go through a script and you kind of sing, but maybe something bigger. And so that's what, I'm my 3rd year. I've done that 3 years with my ward, and it's been, and actually last year I did it with my state. Full thing where all the activities committees were involved, and it was absolutely phenomenal. So, and if you want, I can give you details about what we did and suggestions for how this might work, because there's, you could have individuals celebrating a different way. You could have couples, you could have families, or a whole ward, and it just depends on what you want to do. But yeah, I've done it with my ward for 2 or 3 years now, straight 3 years.
It's so cool. I think first, what you said before that, it would be good to delve into a little more, because something that does intrigue me about the book is the need for the book in such a Christian church, and so I wonder, if you could delve into a bit more, why traditionally Latter-day Saints just haven't really engaged that much with Easter and those traditions.
Yeah, it's a simple answer. It's like, it's not a long-winded answer. It's pretty, scholars or historians or whatever could go and do a big study on and all, and they have. But the short answer is that when in the early days of the church, Joseph Smith, most of the people who were coming to the church were like Methodist, like a large majority were Protestant and Methodist. And then you get into the 20th century, and we largely live in the United States, at least, in an evangelical Protestant culture, right? So we were anti-Catholic. We, as in the United States, in culture, kind of pushing away Catholicism, and that's kind of what happened. We just rejected the cross, kind of pushed it away, and then we had rational answers of why. We focus on the living Christ, not the dead symbols of the dead Christ. You know what I mean? So we just pushed all that away, everything Catholic. And it's starting to, and even evangelicals and others like Baptists and others are starting to slowly warm up to pulling in palm branches, bringing those into the worship service and doing some other things like that. And so it's just our culture. It's how we developed our identity, counter to Catholicism, and other factors as well. It's also not as commercialized as Christmas. That became a big deal. It wasn't a big deal in the early church. We have Joseph Smith's journals saying, on December 25th, we had a little dinner and I studied scriptures or did this or that. And so, that's how it happened. And so it really is hard. It's like spitting in the wind, because even though I've done it 3 straight years with my ward, this year I'm actually moving out of the ward soon, and I haven't heard anything about it. Like the activities committee, they haven't planned anything. And it's fine, but I've done it in my sister's ward, when she was the relief site president. They invited me over there. So now we've had 2 different wards and an entire state. And this year I haven't heard anything. So it's still a work in progress to try to get momentum for people to be excited about it. It's just not in our, it's not in our minds. But so what I did is I proposed a couple years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I did it with my own family. So I had my parents, my kids, my mother-in-law, one of my brothers-in-law, and they came. It was just a small setting. And I said, okay, this is like the first annual Holy Week Last Supper banquet, something like that. You can call it whatever, like the Holy Week Last Supper banquet. And I wanted to kind of have the feel like of a Passover without actually doing a Passover, because we're not Jewish and I didn't want to appropriate and like just do a Passover. I wanted to do something that was meaningful for us. And so we had certain foods that we ate. There's a book called The Foods and Feasts of Jesus, where there's Mediterranean recipes, pita bread and that sort of stuff. And so we made a bunch of food that Mediterranean people would have eaten. The kids aren't like way excited about it. I mean, there's figs, and so we try to add other stuff, but everything was like, we had lamb and there's chicken and pita, and we had eggs and pretzels, and some of those are not Mediterranean like pretzels, but they might have been symbolic in Europe at certain times, starting in the early modern period, that was in relation to Easter and Christianity. Okay, so we had all this food, and then what I did is I put together a little script, like a paper, and we say, okay, here's some of the texts we can read, just as a ritual, and there's certain questions that we can ask. Again, this back and forth, kind of like Passover, where you create a ritual and you ask the same questions, like what's Christ's primary message throughout his ministry? Then we have a few passages that we read. We also read about some of the passion narratives where he's in Gethsemane, he's being arrested. And we did that. And then we went over into where the TV room is, and we'd watch like part of a Jesus film, like the Son of God, whether it's a Latter-day Saint or non-Latter-day Saint, we just watch that film. And so that was the very first one. So then the next year I proposed to my ward. I said, let's do a full-blown big thing where we can get the Elders Quorum, the Relief Society, the young men and young women. Everybody can bring different props or different things into the gym, the cultural hall, and then we can have a 2 or 3-part experience. So number one, we can have a worship, kind of like a worship service, where we sing, we pray, we dress nice in the chapel, and there's like a program. And in the program, for example, I would get up and I would give a brief history of how Holy Week came to be, with Constantine and stuff, and we can talk about that. I can share with you what I do in the ward. But, and then we'd stop and somebody would sing, choir, and then I'd come back and I would review the days of the week and how other Christians have done it. We invited a local Catholic woman who's right in the heart of Provo. Everybody knows her and she's great. We invited her to talk about her experience with some of these traditions as a Catholic, and then we'd sing some more, say the closing prayer. And then we'd have everybody file into the gym and go past the Stations of the Cross. So, and we talk about this more, but when you go to Jerusalem for 1,700 years, at least 1,500 years, there's the Via Dolorosa, which is the way of the cross. And there's certain stations along the way that pilgrims would go, and they would stop at each station and read texts or commemorate a certain event, in Jesus's walking with the cross. So we actually have pictures up along the gym, and they go and they look at each station, learn about it. Then they go get their food, full of Mediterranean food, whatever, sit down. And while they're eating, I was up on the stage with the youth reenacting the Last Supper, teaching them, okay, here's where the apostles would sit. What's the custom, the Greco-Roman Jewish custom of eating food in this setting? You're laying down, reclining on your left elbow on the floor. We're up on the stage doing this, so people can kind of get a visual for what we were doing there. And, and then we'd have, the choir come up and sing again while everybody's eating and stuff. And that was just sort of the guinea pig experience. And then they loved it so much, they did it next year. And then my whole entire state did it. And we had people bringing decorations and big palm branches. And it was really fun. One lady she decorates eggs, Ukrainian eggs, ornate eggs. She'd bring all those around the table. And the whole ward was involved. Everybody loved it. And one guy came up to me he's a professor at Utah Valley University. He's like a man's man, sort of like he's an auto mechanics professor. He comes up to me. He's like, man, I thought this was going to be so boring, to be honest. Like, I didn't want to come. I thought, oh, I'll just go and support, like, what is this like Easter thing in the middle of the week on a Friday night? He's like, but I'm telling you, I absolutely loved it. And it made the whole week. Like I'm actually looking forward to Holy Week now. So that's fun. I mean, that's fun when people respond that way, whether it's your family or people in your ward.
I just think.
So yeah, that's
yeah, I think it's absolutely fantastic that this kind of rolled out, and it shows that it is possible. And my head was kind of filled with ideas of, how I could help my local area get involved with this, as you said. And I think it's fun because there aren't kind of set traditions set in stone, that you can be creative with it. And there's something I love about the kind of links to the feasts that were happening at the time, like the Passover and with the different historical stuff, is there's so much symbolism involved. And I think it's really cool, even with like the food, as you were saying, with your own family. It's like you can even put a meal together, and the type of food that you eat, there's so much rich symbolism based on the history that we have and the knowledge that we have. It's like even the lamb, we had Linda Cherry on a few weeks ago, and she was talking about the feasts and all of that stuff. And I just think it's really cool. So, and how long have your stake been doing this now? Have they adopted it for a few years now?
They've adopted it for a few years, but like I said, this year we didn't hear anything. We didn't do anything, but I could have pushed them, in November, December. But that's the thing. We don't want to have. They probably think, well, this was Trevan Hatch doing this, and he sort of put it all together and got people involved. And without him, maybe we don't have an expert to stand up at the podium and talk about it. But so maybe that's what they're thinking. But you don't need that. You don't need a scholar. Like you can just reference this book or another book, anything you want. And you can just worship, or you can read scripture, and then you can go have your meal. You can do whatever you want. You can sing, and it's a time for us to just reflect. And you could literally do whatever you want. I mean, you could come up with a meal depending on your culture. The food you eat could literally be anything. It could be lasagna, and you could figure out a way to teach your kids the way you make it. It's okay. This type of the food represents this. And then we have some lamb in there. Like, I don't know, you could make up anything and tie it, some symbols to it, or teaching moments for the kids, tie some sort of symbolism. And that's the beauty of it. You could do whatever you want. You don't have to appropriate and feel like it's got to be rigid. It's got to be specific, and the food's gross because it's pita and whatever. You don't have to do that. Do whatever you want.
I'm trying, as you speak, I'm trying to think of an analogy for lasagna and Easter.
Yeah,
I'll keep thinking.
You got the sauce, the blood of Christ. You can do whatever.
Yes.
That's kind of
weird. But I suppose that's the great value of your book, though, is that you don't need to have your own in-person BYU scholar to come and share it. You've made it so accessible, and that's the great value of it. But it would be interesting to hear from you about kind of the evolution of Easter, if you will. Like, what I haven't really thought about it before, but obviously Easter wasn't a thing until after. When did Easter become a thing, and when did Holy Week develop? And how has it changed to the kind of in the UK? It's kind of pathetic now, which is why it would be great to reinstill some of the actual religious traditions. But yeah, that would be interesting to learn about.
Yeah. So, it is. It's fascinating because what we have in the Gospels, and I talk about this with my students when I teach courses here, at BYU in relation to Jesus, is that when I ask my students, in fact, I can even ask you, and you could guess what most Latter-day Saints would say, or most people would say, and that the question is, what percentage of the Gospels deal with the last week of Christ's life? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is that a full third or even 40%? What would you guess that most Latter-day Saints or most Christians, unless they know the answer and they read it somewhere, but just your typical Christian would guess, take any of the Gospels, what percentage would you guess is deals with the last week of his life?
I would say like a good 40 to 50%, right? It's a pretty big chunk.
Yeah. And I when way back before I learned all this stuff, I thought, maybe it's 25%, maybe it's a third. It's only a week. We had, I'm trying to think of the text, but 70%.
Oh wow!
It's two thirds. Now there's a couple of the Gospels where, if you track it from when Jesus he's at Caesarea Philippi with the apostles saying, and this is clearly towards the end of his ministry, he says, I've got to go to Jerusalem, and he tells the apostles, he's prepping them, even hinting or saying that he's going to, give his life. And then Peter says, no, you're not going to. That setting onward is 50 to 70% of each gospel. It just depends on how much of the teaching traditions, like in Luke, he takes a lot of those teaching traditions and he puts them in Jesus's mouth after that moment when they're on the road to Jerusalem, like that long trek down the Jordan Valley toward Jericho and then over to Jerusalem. That's where he dumps a lot of his gospel in, so it inflates it. But even without that, it's a full 2/3. And so you have this big tradition. This is what the Gospels are about. They're not biographies. They're not, because you get a biography, even ancient biographies deal with, you would expect something about their parents and their birth and their psychological development, and then in the large portion of their ministry or their career as a military man or whoever you're writing about. But Jesus, we don't have that. We have a tiny bit about his birth, a little tiny, like one verse about his youth, and then it jumps straight into his ministry. And then the full thing is about his passion. So the word passion comes from, the Passions of Christ, Mel Gibson's, people hear the word Passion of Christ. That comes from Greek and Latin meaning suffering. It's the suffering of Christ. So that is Gethsemane, that's his rest, his trial, his death, the passion narratives. And so what happens, so Jesus goes through that, and then his apostles set up the church in Jerusalem. And obviously, if you read Paul, he's not focused a lot on Jesus's ministry. And scholars are trying to guess how much Paul actually knew of some of the traditions. He doesn't, you could take everything that Paul says that Jesus did or said, and you could put on an index card, 3x5 card. He's not really tapped into Jesus's deeds and sayings. But you have these traditions developing, people remembering them, then people start writing them down. And you go through a couple hundred years and you get this guy named Constantine, the Roman emperor, and he becomes a Christian. And the custom for, in that culture is to find places that are holy spots and build temples or monuments. So even in the 2nd century, you had the Emperor Hadrian. Even Hadrian is building, this is early 2nd century, he's building monuments, temples to the different gods over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or where the Holy Sepulchre would be built, like that spot where the church would later be built. He built one on the Temple Mount. And because these are the tradition of the locals, is that something important and holy happened here, sacred, whatever word we want to use. Okay. So by the time you get to Constantine and he becomes a Christian, his first thought is, I want to go build a frame, as it were, around the spots associated with our Lord. And so he sends his mother, Helena. She goes to Israel, Palestine, and she starts to talk. She has the texts. She has whatever data she's using. She's interviewing locals. Where was Jesus born? She goes to Bethlehem. And they say, well, our tradition has him born right here in this cave or this spot. Okay, so they build the Church of the Nativity right on that spot, and they build another church on the Mount of Olives, and then they built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre right in Jerusalem, right in the city. And this is to put a stamp on this spot. An important thing happened here. Well, what happens? So that is in the early 4th century, and by within like one lifetime, within 60 years, you have pilgrims, a full-blown like program for pilgrims to come and follow Jesus's footsteps through, through Holy Week. In fact, we have a 4th century in the 380s. We have Agaria, this Spanish pilgrim, comes. I pulled her book down. This is just a translation.
Wow.
The pilgrimage of Agaria. And it's just, you can see how big it is. And she just pours on and on details about what she saw during Holy Week. And this is still in the 4th century. And so it's fascinating. You read, and we put a lot of that in the book, in our book, to show, that she's documenting. We stayed up all night on the Mount of Olives or in this church reading these passages, and people were weeping. And then we followed the bishop from the Mount of Olives down as if we were following Christ down the Kidron Valley into Jerusalem. And it was a huge celebration. And by the 4th century, you have Good Friday, you have Saturday, and then Easter Sunday. So there's 3 days that were celebrated, and then you have readings of the other days. But by the 5th century, they've added Palm Sunday. So you have the first day tacked on to the beginning of the week, and that's essentially where we get Holy Week by the 5th century. So they've been doing this for 1,500 years of pilgrims going to Jerusalem, the purpose of which is to follow Jesus's footsteps and retrace it. And then all over Europe, throughout the Middle Ages, you have, in France, everywhere, in Prague, you have different plays like passion reenactments in the churches and elsewhere during Holy Week. So it just spreads, and people have been doing this for centuries. And so when Latter-day Saints start to do some of this, even if it's in our gym, going through the Stations of the Cross and talking about it, we are joining in a millennium and a half, 1,500 year tradition. So, and I love that, because even if the texts aren't quite precise where he was or what he said, sometimes they are precise, or if Helena if she didn't locate the spots exactly, that doesn't matter, because pilgrims said, this is what tradition says Jesus did, what he said, where he did it. And it makes it a holy place to join with fellow Christians. I think it's fascinating. I just love to learn about it. So yeah, if anybody wanted to pick up the Pilgrimage of Agaria, you could read this.
That is so cool. I absolutely love that. But how did that get from that to eggs and stuff like that?
Yeah, so that was just like, a lot of the traditions. So you have Christians living in different parts of the world. Different pagans have different symbols, eggs, springtime symbols, and Christians would adopt some of that and then change it. So okay, so Christ was resurrected, so bird egg is a perfect symbol, or whatever. And you'd have traditions of people decorating them or decorating other foods to make this season of fertility, or rebirth. There's all kinds of different traditions. So that's where that comes from. And Christians would kind of like massage it and change it. So I don't think we need to, a lot of people worry like, all the bunny and the eggs and all this stuff is weird, pagan nonsense. I guess, you're fine to take that position. You can just sort of jettison that stuff, or you can say, Christians use those symbols in their culture, change them, attach different rationale or different symbols upon those things, and ran with it. And so I'm fine with whatever we can do to make it, especially for kids, if they've got all this candy and there's little eggs, at least it adds to that nostalgia, it's just like Christmas. Like there's all this stuff around that's not really associated with Jesus, but it adds to the magic, adds to the fun of it. And as people get older, they can pull in more and more spirituality and just make it fun for them.
I, for one, am very supportive of keeping chocolate eggs in existence. I enjoy having them. But I do think it's an interesting reflection on society when you consider the history that you've shared and just how long these traditions have been going on for. And then you see the kind of mainstream of its day. I can't speak for America. America seems like it's still got that kind of religious zeal to it. But in the UK, well, for example, we had a television show, which was a really big show here, which is a spin-off of an American show, The Apprentice. And they had an Easter special, and the teams were tasked to create Easter eggs and pitch to businesses.
Oh, nice.
So it was so strange because they spoke so much of Easter, and there was almost this intentional, like, we cannot mention Jesus or the Christian nature of it. And they even said they created this character for Easter called Easter Ed. And Easter Ed, and they said, well, Christmas has this figure that promotes kindness and charity and goodness. And we don't have that for Easter because the Easter bunny doesn't represent that. So, like, we've got Santa. We need someone who we can look up to as an example in Easter. So we've created Easter Ed. And I was just sat there like, this is crazy. And, I'm very supportive of religious diversity, but in the UK, there's a lot of investment and so much celebration at the moment going into Ramadan. And especially in London, they lit the streets with Ramadan, and they're allowing Muslim people to pray on London Bridge and stuff, and do very public celebrations. However, next month when it comes to Easter, there will be a complete silence, almost as if, and you might suspect that it's intentional, that we don't want to take this on, or that people are not interested. And I find that such a shame. And so I find it really important when we do episodes like this, that for me, and hopefully for some of the listeners that will listen to you speak and listen to the history and be inspired about it, to say, even if I just do one intentional thing where I'm going to celebrate Easter myself in a special way, or encourage someone else to, I just think that's so important. And yeah, I just find it a shame that we're losing that connection. But as you say, I'm hopeful with the work that you're doing, and with Elder Stevenson's talk and President Oak's video, that we can reignite that love for Easter. Do you have that sense of hope since doing the book as well?
I do, yeah, because I didn't know how people would take this. I thought we'd get criticism and be like, oh, you guys are trying to like force us to be Catholics, or there's always people that might say that, I thought. But when we published this and people started reading it, there was, and then when the brethren were talking about this in 2023 during conference, I had emails, I had all kinds of, like, I would see it all over social media, and people were excited. Like, people were trying to, and I myself, and I can talk about some of the traditions with my family, and also give, Eric Huntsman, some of the things that I've heard him talk about, what he does, and people are excited about it. Like, they're commenting, oh, you're watching the Prince of Egypt or Joseph, the DreamWorks Joseph movie, even though that's not about Christ. Those traditions are embedded in Easter in certain ways, in the liturgy, Catholic liturgy. And so, people would be excited about it. Like, oh, that's a good idea. On Thursday, the traditional day of the Last Supper, to either watch a Jesus movie or to watch the Prince of Egypt and talk about Passover. There's 1,000 different traditions. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful, because I could see just how excited people were to learn about this stuff and add in, especially people with small kids, and they wanted something to do and to develop their traditions. So I'm very hopeful about it. One thing that if you don't mind, I'll give you a few examples of some of the things that Eric Huntsman and I have done. So he's given a couple podcasts, last year on this, and he's told this story 2 or 3 times, but he has a very deliberate approach. Like, I'm envious. I can't really, I guess I could do it with my kids, but I have 5 kids, and they're like right in the middle of club volleyball, and, they've got baseball and stuff. But Eric, he's got 2 kids, and he's managed to have this phenomenal Good Friday where, for years, he's taken his kids out of school on Good Friday, and he had to call, like, the story he tells, that he had to call Teamview High School here in Provo and say, I'm getting my daughter out of school. And they say, oh, why? He's like, well, it's a holiday. Like, oh, what holiday? He's like, well, it's Good Friday. And the secretary is like, "Oh, what are you? What religion are you?" He's like, "I'm a Christian." Trying to make that point that most of these kids are Christians and nobody even gives it a thought. So he would take his kids out of school and they would do like a fast, because there's a tradition of fasting for some of these days. They would take their kids to the temple and do baptisms for the dead. Or as the kids got older, they'd go do different sessions. And they would, the night before or that night, they would go to a local service, a Good Friday service. They would break their fast at a local restaurant, the same restaurant every year, just to make it fun, for the family. And I mean, that's a phenomenal, like, deliberate approach. But some of the things that we've done with our family is we'll make little Lazarus cakes, on Lazarus Saturday, the day before Holy Week. In some traditions, they'll make these little figurine breads where the arms are folded, like you wrap the dough and the arms are folded. It looks like a little mummy. So it's like, in Greece, it's Lazarakia, it's called little Lazaruses, these little spicy, like spiced cinnamon things. And so that we would do it with the kids. We've done that a couple of years. We'd watch some shows about Jesus. We would talk about certain things, and then we do stuff with the family. We try to do as much as we can with a Mediterranean meal on Thursday. And so those are some of the things that we've done, and it's been great. And even in the years where it's busy, like, I don't know, we're really, really busy this year. And if the only thing we did is to just carve out a day and say, look, let's just get together and watch one movie of Christ. So there's a whole bunch of Jesus movies, or even the Joseph of Egypt, DreamWorks one, and then pause it and pull in examples of how Joseph is a type of Christ. He's been sold into slavery by his brothers, and he becomes a king in effect. It just allows us to dialogue with the kids and help them get some sort of spirituality and to mark that week as something that's more important than just another week. So, yeah, those are some things that we've done. Our family.
We're lucky that at the UK we have Good Friday as a public holiday, and I hear that that's in the plans in Utah. That legislation is advancing to make Good Friday a public holiday, which is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I didn't hear that, but even last year at BYU, we had all kinds of students sending in messages to the administration, like, why are we having school on Good Friday?
Yeah, that's strange. So I feel grateful hearing that I've had that growing up, and hopefully I've taken advantage of that in the past to celebrate Easter. Which, actually, it might be helpful for you at this stage to maybe take us through the traditional kind of what Christians do on each day of the Holy Week briefly, and maybe ways that they prepare for it, and then we can finish off this episode with contrasting that to some really good takeaways for Latter-day Saints to say, we've had this episode, we've got this information, here's what we can do.
Yeah, that'd be great. So like, if we could even start with Ash Wednesday, like briefly talk about Lent and Ash Wednesday, and it's 40 days plus some Sabbaths in there, depending on Eastern Christianity versus Western Christianity. But essentially, it starts on Ash Wednesday, where, like, if you'll see, I was actually in New York City one Ash Wednesday, and this is about 10 years ago, and it was on my radar. I completely didn't know anything. And I'm walking around New York City. Everybody's got this ash cross on their forehead. And I'm like, oh, it's Ash Wednesday. I had no idea. So, that starts this sort of this time period of preparation for Holy Week, and this is, so you've got Fat Tuesday, you have Ash Wednesday, and there's Mardi Gras, and there's Carnival, and there's these different, observances or traditions that people use to prepare. And so this Mardi Gras and Carnival kind of stuff that's like right before, it's kind of when you hear about the debauchery and sort of sexual promiscuity that's involved in those settings, the culture kind of feeds it, because it's a time for gluttony, and kind of you eat a bunch of food because then you're going to start a fast, and it's just sort of spun off and developed. But that's where even those holidays that we hear about in Louisiana with Mardi Gras, there's all these parades, and that's all tied to, in some way, to this season. And what people do is they find things that in their life that they want to get better at. Let's say somebody uses a lot of profanity, or they play a lot of video games, or whatever. They eat a ton of sugar, whatever they think their vice is. This is a time of year where they can say, okay, I'm going to give up some of that and do better, and add prayer and, and prepare for several weeks to Holy Week, prepare for Holy Week. So that's, in a very small, nutshell, that's Ash Wednesday, Lent. And then when you arrive on the day before Palm Sundays, Lazarus Saturday, like we said, it's a very minor holiday for the Eastern Orthodox, like Greek and Russian Orthodox. Some of the Oriental Orthodox groups, like Ethiopic Christians, Coptic Christians, and Syriac Christians, they have this Lazarus Saturday where they read John 11, where Lazarus is raised from the dead. And it's, this is where they make those little Lazarus cakes, and they have, it's kind of a preparation where Jesus performed a miracle that really put the sights on him from the temple establishment, at least in John. Like, that's where, this guy is no good. He's dangerous. And it sort of kicks off, Jesus's arrival in Jerusalem. So then the next day on Palm Sunday, this is the triumphal entry of Jesus. So people would read some of those texts where Jesus is entering Jerusalem. And by the end of the 4th century, this is where Easter, like we said before, Easter had expanded, like Holy Week had expanded to include Palm Sunday. And for centuries, clear back to Agaria, Spanish pilgrim we were talking about, you have people, thousands of people going to the Mount of Olives with palm branches, and they're following the bishop down the Mount of Olives, again, tracing Jesus's footsteps, down the Mount of Olives in the Kidron Valley up into, through the East Gate into Jerusalem. That still happens today. The BYU Jerusalem Center kids do that when they're there during, if there's the semester ends in April, so it depends on what time of year, but they'll participate in that. They got pictures. You can look up, BYU Jerusalem Center students, Palm Sunday procession. You probably see those. So yeah, Agaria talks about that clear back in the 4th century, them doing that procession. Palm Sunday is also sometimes called Fig Sunday in some cultures, and this is to commemorate Jesus cursing the fig tree, Matthew 21. A lot of churches today will distribute palm branches during Palm Sunday services. Congregants, they'll take palm branches and decorate their homes, put them around in their homes. And, in England, I think it's become customary to eat figs or fig pudding on this day. And I don't know if that's still a thing, but,
yeah, I'm not sure.
That's
in some denominations, probably.
Yeah. And then you get to, so then you have Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and actually Thursday, which were slower liturgical days. The liturgy, there's not, there wasn't as much, but they still have services, and they'll still show up and they'll read certain passages. So Holy Monday, or you could also call it, some people call it Great Monday in the Christian tradition. This day, in some of the Gospels, was the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple in Matthew and Luke. So Agaria reports that there were certain prayers and services at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem on Monday. And then in the modern era, there's commemorations and activities. They're largely worship services. So like in the Eastern Orthodox Christian groups, they have a service called the Bridegroom service. And this is there's two major events that they read about and discuss that the Bridegroom service is centered around. It's the cursing of the fig tree and Joseph the patriarch, which is why I watched the Joseph of Egypt DreamWorks movie with my kids. The Joseph of Egypt commemorates Joseph as a prototype of Christ, sold by foreigners, by his brothers, imprisoned on false charges. So to get a feel for the Monday service, you can actually get on YouTube and you could type in the Bridegroom service, Greek Orthodox bride. So if you type in Greek Orthodox Bridegroom service, you can see the whole service, and you can kind of skip through it or look through it. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube and get a sense of that liturgy. And so that's Great Monday or Holy Monday. When you get to Holy Tuesday, these are the teachings of Jesus in the temple and also on the Mount of Olives with the Olivet Discourse, right? Because remember, he's going back and forth from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem, staying at Beit Fagi and some of those little towns up on the Mount of Olives, and he's going back and forth. And so, at least traditionally in the text, he's doing a lot of teaching, contending with priests, delivering the Olivet Discourse. And so, the Holy Tuesday service repeats from Holy Monday. It's kind of the same service with some stuff added in. Agaria explains that worshipers in Jerusalem in the 4th century, even back then, they repeated the Monday service at the Holy Sepulchre. So churches do a variation of those things. You get to Holy Wednesday, which is sometimes called Spy Wednesday.
Yeah.
And
I learned about this.
It's like phenomenal. This is one of my favorites. And because I've done a lot of research and writing on Judas and the conspiracy and some of the misconceptions about like what's happening. So I love this day, Spy Wednesday. So it's really it's a quiet day in terms of the celebration, but Christians remember that this is when Judas began conspiring with chief priests on this day, like right the day before the Last Supper. So Roman Catholics, for example, they'll participate in the Tenebrae, it's the Tenebrae service. And Tenebrae means something like darkness in Latin. And during the service, it's very powerful because they'll have 15 light candelabra, 15 candles. And that's the only source of light in the church. And so when they're throughout the service, they'll extinguish a light on occasion. So by the time you get to about 20 to 30 minutes left in the Tenebrae service, all the lights are gone and it's completely dark. And it's kind of, nerve-wracking for the kids, completely dark. And you're just supposed to think of the depression, the depressing feeling that Jesus is being, people are conspiring with him, against him at that moment. So, and then, I love that symbolism. Like, I wish I could be, go to some more of those services. Maybe I'll take my kids this year. We've never been, but maybe I'll hunt out a Spy Wednesday, like a Tenebrae service and go to it. And then by the time, so that's Wednesday, then you get to Thursday, and it's called Maundy Thursday. Maundy is from the Latin mandatum, or we get commandment. That's from John 13:34, where Jesus says, "I give to you a new commandment." So that's where you get Maundy Thursday. It's one of the busiest liturgical days in the week. The liturgy is robust in both Western and Eastern Christian groups. Way back, like Agaria mentions how Christians in Jerusalem, after the prayers and services were over at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they would move to the Mount of Olives and do more reading up there. And it was just it's a big, busy day. The emphasis on that day is the Last Supper, and particularly the sacrament and the washing of feet. So from late antiquity, even to the present, you have many Christians who engaged in the ritual of feet washing. And sometimes they'll do it for the poor. There's some accounts where bishops or popes or emperors or some of these types of people, kings, would wash the feet of poor people in their area, provide them a meal, give them some money and clothing, because that's what Christ did. See what else would they do? Yeah, that's Thursday. One of the things I found in my research, which was fascinating, is that the tradition has Jesus celebrating Passover on Thursday. And some scholars debate whether that was actually Passover and if Jesus was having a Passover meal. But the tradition is, regardless if it was literally Passover meal in the Last Supper, is irrelevant because it's Passover season. And I came across an ancient Jewish tradition. Like, this is my area of specialty, is Judaism and antiquity. And I came across a tradition that places the Exodus of Egypt starting on Thursday, the 15th of Nisan, right there, and so it'd be, it would be important. It would be logical to think that Jesus would, obviously they're participating in the Passover festivities. And so that was kind of cool to kind of read about that. So Thursday provides a lot of ideas for congregants and families. You got food, you've got different narratives you can read. And so that's kind of fun, for Thursday. Good Friday, a lot of people know about Good Friday, but this is when Jesus was put on the cross. Agaria explained that a crowd of Christian worshipers, they would stay awake all night on Good Friday because, if Christ is on the cross, it'd be inappropriate for us to just go to sleep and get this great, really good night's rest. So they'd stay up all night, fast, and they could feel the weight the next morning of the service on Saturday morning. They were kind of grumpy, thirsty, hungry, tired, and then they could feel some of what Jesus felt. So, and that's the point of that. A medieval tradition. This is actually really fascinating, as when pilgrims would come all the way from different parts of Europe, they would come into Israel, Palestine. The purpose was to show up and then get in line and try to convince the guards to let you into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and be locked in, starting on Friday all the way through Saturday, and then come out on Sunday, just like Jesus was locked in the tomb. And so we have accounts of people. They lock the doors, and there are people just sort of wandering around, getting into mischief, carving their coat of arms into the walls. And you can still see some of that today. You can see all throughout the walls of Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And if you're an archaeologist and you know what you're looking for, you can spot ancient graffiti and ancient carving, and distinguish it from what people are doing today. You'll still see people writing markers all over the walls, but that would actually be a very intriguing. I would actually do that with my kids, is lock ourselves in our house. Hey, it's Friday. On Saturday we have to stay over Friday. On Saturday we can't go outside. We got all the curtains, make it kind of dark, play games, do whatever we want. And then on Sunday we'll get up and we'll go to church. And so that was a fun tradition I learned about in for medieval Christians. A lot of mischief. There was one account of a guy who was a cloak. I forget his name, what they called him. He had a cloak and he had a little dagger and a little hammer under his cloak. And he would bend over the slab in the Holy Sepulchre where Jesus was laid. And he would chip off a chunk of it, and hide it in his robe, and then take it back to Europe and sell it for a lot of money. A lot of those kinds of things happening. But that's Good Friday. A lot of different cultures, they have parades with floats that depict a certain scene in Jesus's life. And they have their services where they follow the way of the cross, the different stations of the cross. You get to Holy Saturday, called Black Saturday, by some people. In the early centuries of the Christian era, this is a relatively quiet day again. Good Friday's busy. Easter Sunday is also kind of quiet. Sometimes because when Jesus is resurrected, everything's over. By Sunday morning, you've already read everything, you've done all the liturgy, you've done everything. But Saturday is also quiet. But this is a time with some of the services where you are commemorating what is called the harrowing of hell, where Christ descends into hell to redeem the saints in the Hebrew Bible. So there's early Christian art depicting, for example, Jesus holding the hands of Adam and Eve, bringing them out of what we call hell into Jesus' presence. There's some of that is rooted in some anti-Semitism, where the Hebrew Bible, the God of the Hebrew Bible, and those people were following an evil God. Marcion, who was an early Christian, the first one who tried to establish a canon and put together text, the first New Testament canon, very anti-Semitic. He didn't include, it was his idea that the God of the Old Testament wasn't Jesus, it was a different figure, an evil God. So Christianity's had to work their way through some of those ideas. But there is that within all of those complex ideas, you have this harrowing of hell where Jesus is redeeming certain people, certain figures of the Hebrew scriptures. So there's the holy fire thing that you guys see on the news sometimes, where they'll go into the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you can look it up on YouTube. It's happened every year for 1,700 years, where the claim is that there's a holy spark, candle that's been lit. The bishop goes into the Holy Sepulchre, and miraculously, candles lit, and then he comes out and he lights the other candles that people are holding, and then they turn around and light the candles behind him, and it spreads throughout the Holy Sepulchre. And then they take candles immediately to Bethlehem, light that candle. they'll take candles and put them on planes and fly all over the Christian world, lighting different candles in the United States, even in Cyprus, in Russia, and different parts of the world. And it all comes from the Holy Sepulchre and then goes out throughout the world. So that's kind of fun. There's been the church, I think, burned down, or there's been fires. There's been controversy. This is the Eastern Church. The Western Church, Roman Catholics, they haven't celebrated this, participated in a sense, the year 1238, when Pope Gregory the Ninth declared this miracle of fraud. He says, we're not going to participate in that. We don't believe that that's happening. That's just a fraud. So there's that kind of fun tradition that people will see on the news, or if something happens, that's what they'll see. So yeah, then you get to Easter Sunday. It's also called the Resurrection Sunday, which I love. I prefer that over Easter. Resurrection Sunday. You have the Easter egg elements we talked about. But by Sunday's dawn, many Christians, they've already completed a lot of their liturgy, and it's just a time to spend with the family, and there's all kinds of traditions with good food, and it's a pretty calm day. So that's kind of a crash course of Holy Week and what people have done on those days.
That's fascinating. There's so much in there that I had no idea of. Particularly, I love the Lazarus Saturday. I don't think I've heard of that before, but I think that's a really nice, it's such a powerful story. But yeah, there's so much to chew on and think about for Latter-day Saints too. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us and giving us that crash course. As we kind of, I think a good way to close this would just be kind of what thing do you wish Latter-day Saints would take away from all of what we've spoken about, kind of a final message to them on celebrating Easter and making it a special time? What would you kind of wish that you could leave them with, if you could leave them with one message?
Yeah, one thing I would say is just to start with something. If you don't want to spend $35 on our book, then don't buy it, but do something. There's all kinds of ideas online that you can do with your kids, and just start a tradition somewhere. Even if you've never done anything except Easter Sunday, just add Lazarus Saturday or add Good Friday. Look at your calendar. If your kids aren't playing baseball or whatever sport, the spring sports, whatever day, it could be a Thursday, and say to your whole family, I keep saying family, but it doesn't have to be your family. If you're somebody who's not married, but you're part of like a group, like an empty nesters group, or you've got your book group, like a group that you want to study with, it could be a ward group. Whoever it is, you can say, hey, let's carve out, let's all get together on Thursday and we'll all make food, Mediterranean food, whatever we want. Let's watch a Jesus film and just reflect and talk, and then we'll do our thing on Easter. Add something and start your traditions, and then write everything down. Write exactly the traditions you did, so that the next year you don't have to remember and you forget something you did, and you just add to it. And I would just start there. And the reason why we wanted to add in all these traditions from the Christian, past and present, is to get Latter-day Saints to feel like they're missing out a little bit, to feel some holy envy and to be inspired. You can make a big list. In fact, in the book, in Appendix D, this is the Appendix D, where we shorten the whole book down to little bullet points where you can sing these hymns, read these passages of Scripture, eat these kinds of foods, or whatever. And it's right there in a snapshot for Palm Sunday, Holy Monday, whatever. And you can go through. You can go buy art, take all the art down in your house that you normally have, put up 3 or 4 pieces every Easter. The sky's the limit on what you can do. And so I just encourage people to be inspired by other Christians, use them as examples and sort of adapt and change what they do, and you can do it in your home. Put a little pressure on your bishop and your local leadership to say, hey, next year in November, December, let's add in our calendar part of our budget for an Easter party. And then you can help shape what that party, that celebration, that worship service, whatever it is, you can help shape what that looks like. So that's my suggestion, is just to dive in and enjoying this experience, this 1700-year experience with other Christians, and then, shape it for your family.
I love this theme of holy envy, and as you said, being inspired by other Christians. That's something that really enhanced my Christmas experience. Trying to get away from the commercialization of that was we went to the local cathedral and joined in the festival of lessons and carols and midnight mass, and it was just such a wonderful way to usher in Christmas. And so, I'm definitely going to be hunting out a Tenebrae service or any service I can get to, but that one sounds particularly interesting. So I'm going to try and get to it.
Yeah, totally.
But
me too.
But thank you so much, Trevan, for spending some time with us and really providing such valuable information and advice and encouragement for making Easter the important part of the year that it should be and will be.
Yeah, thanks again for the invite. Yeah, this was fun.
Thank you. And I'll link in the description a link to the book and your YouTube channel as well, which I know you were saying you haven't done a video for a while, but it's a great resource there of past videos and stuff about your work. So yeah, thank you very much, Trevan.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.